This episode of TRL is brought to you by nobody other than myself. As a quick reminder, 75%, I've said it before, it bears repeating, and just to set the groundwork for this episode, 75% of all TV revenue comes from pharmaceutical manufacturers. That's why, like, when I was flipping through the channels the other day and came across a tennis match, Pfizer's plastered on a banner in the background. That's why on any version of any news organization's Health Watch, brought to you by Moderna. They're all over the place. So that's not to say that everything these news organizations tell you about pharmaceutical interventions is false. It is to tell you that they are highly incentivized to highlight the good things about pharmaceutical companies and their products, and to low light, they're definitely not expected. You can't expect them, when their revenue's coming from that industry, to come on and talk about, are vaccines responsible, somewhat at least, for the increased trends in all-cause mortality that we're seeing across highly vaccinated countries? Are they in part or at all responsible for lower than usual birth rates in those same countries? But that's the data that I want to talk to you about today. And I want to talk about that data because it's arguably the best data we have, in the sense that it's the least susceptible to political pressure and other pressure. It's really hard to fudge numbers about just how many people in any given population are dying. And so what I'm going to talk about, broadly speaking, is not, I'll tell you what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to say that the ultimate conclusion in a correlation, so yet these highly vaccinated countries and these higher than usual all-cause mortality rates and lower than usual birth rates are just implicitly like tied together. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I do think there's a responsibility of our scientific community to look into it and to maybe see, just in general, if more people are dying. Like, remember when we used to see death tolls daily from COVID? So in the past, we've cared so much about death rates, right? And hospitalization rates. If we still care about death rates and hospitalization rates, let's look into why more people are dying and why fewer people are being born. What's impacting fertility rates and birth rates? So, because it could be a lot of other things, right? It could be, you could make an argument that lockdown policies had implications here. Maybe people were getting less access to healthcare for major medical issues over the course of the lockdowns. But let's just look at the data and then see what signals and or conclusions we can draw from this. So the first example is the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, like many other European countries, they had very high vaccination rates. So across the Netherlands, regardless of where you went, which city or town, vaccination rates were anywhere between 70 to 90%. So they have pretty high compliance. They have recently published in a research paper that they have been experiencing higher than usual all-cause mortality rates, COVID deaths excluded. So here's what the scientific community thought would happen. They thought after COVID deaths started to fall, which they have, that all-cause mortality would also start to fall. That was the expected trend. Well, what we've seen is the opposite. Literally the opposite has happened. So as COVID deaths have fallen, all-cause mortality has risen, which means that deaths due to things other than COVID have been rising since we have been vaccinating people. Is it because of the vaccines? Is it partially because of the vaccines? I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but these numbers are pointing us in a direction to look at. And specifically what this Netherlands data concluded is that about 5% of total mortality were skewed in a pattern that reflected vaccination rates, meaning about 5% of the excess deaths seemed to be correlating to populations within the Netherlands that were more vaccinated. Let's flip to just European data overall. So all of the largest countries in Western Europe, again, highly vaccinated countries just like the US, have posted death counts above normal. So they're higher at this point in 2022, just to give everyone an idea. They're higher at this point in 2022 than they were at the same points in 2020 and 2021. So again, nobody expected that. They thought, COVID deaths are less now. All-cause mortality rates overall should be falling. And again, the principle it gets back to me is we cared a lot about deaths when the COVID pandemic was going on, and we were having conversations about should we get vaccinated, should we get locked down. You people are plague rats because you're not getting vaccinated. You are the problem here. And now we're at a point where COVID deaths have fallen, and death counts are not only not falling along with them, but they are rising in these same countries. So if we care about people dying, we should care about this data because it's telling us that more people are dying. Why is that? More alarmingly, by the way, in this European data, is the most pronounced change is occurring in teenagers and adults under 50 years old. So deaths, just to, again, give a comparison here, deaths in people under 15 were below normal in Europe until about a year ago in 2021, since which point they have been above normal in people younger than 15. So, and timing of this, why I think it's of importance in relation to the vaccine. I'll continue to call it vaccine just so everybody knows which drug we're talking about. So between March 2020, when COVID began, and early summer of 2021, when most European countries started mass vaccination to people under 50, they had about 3,500 extra deaths. And by extra deaths, they predict the number of expected deaths based on trends. They had about 3,500 excess deaths in young adults at that point. So between the beginning of COVID and the point where they started mass vaccination in people under 50, about 3,500. Since that time, since they started mass vaccinating populations under 50 years old, they've had twice as many. They've had about 7,000 excess deaths. So they're rising in that population that they're vaccinating. And this is it's not an anomaly because it's happening similar trends are happening across all of highly vaccinated countries, mRNA vaccinated countries. But it should be mind-boggling to scientists who are going, wait, hold up here. We're vaccinating our population so that death counts would go down. COVID death counts overall have gone down, not necessarily because of the vaccine, by the way, but because of potentially maybe the vaccine, because there's data to indicate that the vaccine actually reduced all-cause mortality in the older population, so at higher risk of being hospitalized or dying due to COVID. It indicated that it actually reduced deaths in that population, but for people under 50, not the case. We've seen the opposite occur. So hang on, this vaccine was supposed to lower COVID deaths, thereby lowering all-cause mortality, right? We've lowered COVID deaths overall because of the vaccine, maybe because of better therapeutics, maybe because of, we've opened up our economies and people have better access to healthcare again. Who knows? But maybe because we're in phases of things like Omicron, which are less serious than when we were experiencing things like Delta and those stronger earlier variants. But now we're talking about less dangerous variants in general. And we're talking about now we've vaccinated people and death trends are going the wrong way. What's happening? And by the way, deaths in the US and Australia have been running above normal too. I'm just talking about these are specific countries who have actually published, in some cases age stratified. I'll get to that in a second. But countries like Europe and the Netherlands, they're at least posting this data of, hey, here's when we started vaccinating people. Here's what's been happening to death rates and birth rates since then. In New Zealand, above normal death rates in teenagers and young adults have been happening for weeks after they are jabbed with their first dose. And I mention that because meanwhile, here in the US especially, we're still seeing that students are being required to be vaccinated to attend universities. Okay, and yeah, the New Zealand data identifies what I just said in the European case. So for older age ranges, death rates are below the number of expected deaths for the same time period that for younger population, it's the opposite. And, we've heard about certain risks, like the big story about myocarditis in young boys has come out. Now we're seeing other anecdotal data too, to suggest, again, this isn't be all end all data, but it does suggest hey, do we have some places we could look at? Should we be looking at these to see if maybe there's a linkage here? Just a few other anecdotes. A major U.S. airline, and this is where I run the risk of making correlations where I shouldn't. So I'm not saying these are correlations. I'm just saying other little anecdotes that start to pile up and make you go, that's weird. That's weird too. So a major US airline is reporting a 300% rise in long-term disability claims. Why that made me go, is because these are people who were required to be vaccinated in almost every case. There's a story that came out about 5 physicians who were under 50. One was like a marathoner, another was a triathlete, super healthy people who within a 2-week period in Toronto lost their lives. They just died mysteriously. So we're talking that we're seeing these little pockets and examples of mandatorily vaccinated, very healthy people otherwise die. Seems concerning to me. HCA, the biggest hospital in the US, they recently just quietly removed a report. There was a report of this person who acquired unfortunately, a fatal brain illness that accelerated rapidly. And she acquired it within days of being vaccinated. And so there was this report on it, and hey, here's what happened. And there were a lot of views on that webpage. And HCA said that maybe there was a technical glitch because there was a higher than expected number of views on that webpage, so they took it down. Yeah, that's why they took it down, because too many people were looking at a case of a fatality that was linked to receiving the mRNA COVID vaccine. The Canadian province of British Columbia, they just recently stopped publishing their little donut charts on COVID hospitalizations and deaths and the percentage of those that were vaccinated versus unvaccinated, because it started to look increasingly less favorable to vaccines, because basically the hospitalizations and death rates were being taken up by vaccinated populations in those donut charts. So no problem, let's just remove them from the website. We care about death rates and hospitalization rates when we can say the problem is you're not getting vaccinated, and the donut charts illustrate that. We don't really care as much about death rates and hospitalization rates if it's not incenting people to get vaccinated and put billions more in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies. That's just me and how I look at it. That is not the conclusive summary of that data that I just mentioned, those anecdotes that I just mentioned. Singapore, and infertility. So Singapore's birth rate. So Singapore, just as a reminder, it's Singapore, so very high compliance. You can get arrested in the street for and killed for crimes in the US that would get you a slap on the wrist. So needless to say, they had very high compliance when they were told they had to get vaccinated. And again, with mRNA technology, 98% of their population was vaccinated with Moderna or Pfizer. So their data is very interesting because it is age stratified. So we can see the different nuances within different age groups. So the timeline here that I want to level set is nearly every Singapore citizen between the ages of 20 to 39, which is considered childbearing age. I'm not saying if you're younger than 20 or older than 39, you can't have a baby, but this is considered the sweet spot of childbearing age. So nearly every citizen within that range received their first dose of Moderna or Pfizer in June/July, within those few weeks of 2021. Like other highly vaccinated countries, they are now in a baby bust. The timeline here is, so they already have low birth rates, but they had remained stable, lower than, say, here in the US, but stable, same birth rates for about a decade. And exactly 9 months after the population, that 20 to 39 age group was vaccinated, exactly 9 months, the birth trends did an abrupt about face. So they were actually slightly increasing leading up to March of 2022. They reversed, and they declined between March and June. June is the latest data we have out of Singapore from this year. There was a decline in birth rates of about 8.5% each month. So 16% overall is, needless to say, unusual. A 16% decline suddenly 9 months after they vaccinated that population. And we do have, it doesn't seem like there's been any massive study into it, but we do have plenty of at least anecdotal evidence of disruptions in menstrual cycles and decreases, at least temporarily, in sperm counts. So yeah, birth rates, death rates, it's pretty pretty much just is what it is. And the conclusions you draw and what we can say it correlates to or may correlate to, I think it bears looking into. Like, this is happening across all of our highly vaccinated countries, that we're seeing data put out. So a couple of other stories. One is that mRNA, it's not supposed to last long in your cells. So remember, fact checkers told us over and over, like, the spike protein in the vaccines is not dangerous. It's temporarily there to produce spike protein to give you immunity against COVID, and then it goes away. And it's not toxic, don't worry. So the CDC has quietly, they did make a big press release or announcement, but they did remove that part of its website that promises that your body breaks down and gets rid of the mRNA soon after it's finished initially with making spike protein. Meanwhile, evidence continues to pile up that the spike protein does remain in the body for at least months, and that it is far from benign. I myself, when I was sick after getting the vaccine, truth be told, the protocol I went on, and I don't know how directly this is a detox, but the protocol I went on for about 6 weeks was 4 to 6 weeks, somewhere in there. I might have stopped the treatments after 4 weeks. But I did a specific regimen that a lot of doctors kind of did a think tank and determined this is the way to detox your body from the spike protein. That's the detox I did. Again, was that like solely responsible for me feeling better, or was it the supplements I then, continued to take? And yeah, who knows? But that's the kind of regimen I did, was kind of packaged as kind of like here's what you can go buy and try to take supplement wise, and teas you can drink, and different things you can do to detox your body from the spike protein. That's what I did. Because there's been evidence since early on in the vaccination, there's been talk of like, it seems like the spike protein, at least in some people, it leaks. It doesn't stay in that, like, we were acting as if we were like vaccinating people, and it like imprisoned the spike protein in that one localized area. Like, it doesn't get into your cells. Well, it appeared early on even that it leaks. I love, like, leaks from what? Like, you injected something into your body. It's gonna, like, that's how things work. You put something in your body, it's bound to leak somewhere that you don't want it to go. So most recently, a Japanese report came out that a 64-year-old, and again, these are like the cases I'm talking about. It's one here, one there, a few there, maybe a couple hundred over here when we're talking about myocarditis. The numbers aren't like, they're not through the roof, but they are, especially when we weigh in the dangers of Omicron to a 15-year-old boy versus, do we want this 15-year-old boy getting myocarditis or an autoimmune, like type 1 diabetes, or having one of these extreme adverse reactions, or just, running the risk of like what I had, which is just that spike protein seemed to linger around and make them sick over and over. When you start to weigh the risks versus of COVID in these populations versus the potential risks of the vaccines, I think it's worth looking into. And I think we as just ordinary people deserve these answers from the scientific community. That so far we're not seeming to get. We're just having to do what I'm doing and piece together data that's coming out. Like, I'm not qualified to do this and to decide like what's true and what isn't, and what conclusions can be drawn from this data. I'm only qualified to make the decision for myself, and then to come on a tiny podcast and tell you what conclusions I'm making for myself. So after this 64-year-old developed painful skin lesions just a few days after she received the Pfizer vaccine, and after, or it might have been, I can't remember, this person, after they aggressively treated that patient, because it was a virus that was producing these painful skin lesions, they were finding it very treatment averse, so they aggressively treated it, finally went away. They started looking into, they were like, man, this is weird. It developed so rapidly after the vaccine, and it was really persistent and hard to get rid of. It was like her immune system was not well receptive to treatment. So they said, hey, they really deviated from what the medical community is supposed to do. And they said, let's look for spike protein in these skin lesions. And guess what? They found them. There was spike protein in these skin lesions months and months after this person was vaccinated. So these and other researchers have speculated that in chemically modifying that mRNA in these Moderna and Pfizer shots to make it harder for our immune systems to destroy them, what they may have inadvertently done is make a zombie vaccine that won't die. That's their words. No, it's not. It's that's Alex Berenson's words. So it might result in long-term production of that encoded spike protein in our cells. And other examples include just more vaccinated patients. There have been a lot of reports of, and by a lot I mean enough that we should be looking into it, of people reporting autoimmune crises, such as, did you know that type 1 diabetes it's really autoimmune? Like type 2, you can eat yourself into it. You can start having insulin issues and processing issues with sugar and food. Type 1 diabetes it's called childhood diabetes for a reason. It's autoimmune, and it is usually diagnosed in childhood. And they're finding cases of people getting vaccinated and acquiring type 1 diabetes unexpectedly and suddenly. So the British government, I'll end on this. They just recently reported their latest vaccine surveillance report. And in that report, so not only at this point in 2022, when we still have people getting Pfizer tattoos and praising the vaccine, not only are these vaccines not stopping infection or transmission, according to this British vaccine surveillance report, not only are vaccinated adults now being infected at much higher rates than unvaccinated, but now the British government is also saying they're finding that the vaccine is interfering with your body's innate ability after infection to produce antibodies. So what this means is everybody's getting COVID, right? Vaccinated, unvaccinated. They're saying that in an unvaccinated person, their body is producing pretty solid antibodies against multiple parts of the COVID virus. In vaccinated populations, that's not the case. They're finding that their antibody levels are lower, even after they've been infected with COVID. So it's suggesting that because they're vaccinated, that vaccine, that mRNA vaccine, has interfered with their body's innate ability to produce antibodies, specifically against a part of the virus, the nucleocaspid protein. Now I feel very scientific. And that's, and fourth, so that was number 3, that it's potentially interfering with people's ability to build off antibodies. But what that means is it can, in theory, prolong this problem of COVID mutations, because the vaccine is the virus is naturally prone to mutate in that direction. That whatever that nucleocaspid protein that you're not acquiring immunity against, even after you've been infected with COVID, okay, we as a virus are going to just mutate in that direction because we're finding a vulnerability in the population there. So anyways, that's the data dump of boring data. Next time, I hope to have one of my friends. We have very opposing political ideas, and he's going to come on the podcast. He used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, and so I think he'll have a lot of really fun banter and insight there. And so we'll just like do a little social experiment and figure out like if we can come on a podcast and talk about the pharmaceutical industry and also potentially some political ideas and themes, and still come out of it as friends. Can we disagree politically and still be friends? Dun, dun, dun.